Hi everyone, John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn video, and we're looking today at Inspector Goole's context. So obviously if you don't know your capitalism from your socialism, you're in the right place. So we're going to start by looking today at some of the key contextual factors with underlying this kind of brilliant play. Then we'll look at some of the context in action, so how the context actually affects the play. That's really important to make those links. And then we will also then look at some of the key contextual quotes, so some of the greatest hits really from the play and how they impact on the context. Okay then, so if we dive in first at contextual factors, let's wrap our heads around that first. Now then, first off, 1912 society. So the play itself is set in 1912, just before World War I kicked off. So as you can see in the image, it was pretty grim. So two main factors that we need to know for this part. So it had a very strict class system. So the upper class, such as the Birlings, they had a lot of power and they looked down on the working class basically. So if you were in the working class, you were stripped of a lot of your rights, and the upper class kind of basically lorded it over you socially. Then intertwined with that, we have patriarchal values. So remember, patriarchal means male-dominated society. So this was very much a patriarchal society. So men dominated, and women, female characters such as Eva Smith, therefore had few rights or protection because of their working class origins, but also because of their gender. So there's a real kind of almost toxic mix going on in 1912 society, which Priestley was very interested in critiquing and subverting. Really good words for your essays, those two. Okay, so let's have a little look down here then. You've got a really nice image there of the Titanic. So with context, there's a lot of what we would call dramatic irony going on. So Priestley uses kind of real life events that were happening around about 1912 to kind of show that Mr. Birling and the upper class were kind of buffoon-like figures, and they didn't really know as much as they thought they did. So there's two contextual parts you really want to zoom in on when you look at this in class. So the first one is the Titanic. So Mr. Birling calls the ship unsinkable. And as you can see, it looks pretty good in the image we can see there. But we all know, and the audience knows, that it did sink, and it kind of, there was a massive loss of life there. So it was an absolute, stupid thing to say, and it shows his arrogance and his ignorance of kind of engineering and things like that. Also, the dramatic irony strikes when Mr. Birling dismisses the coming war. So there was a war coming in 1914, so just 2 years after the play is set, with Germany, and it was already bubbling up by 1912. So he claims that war with Germany is impossible. Okay, absolutely impossible, not going to happen. However, we know that World War I kicked off 2 years after that. And then the audience, because the play was actually written in 1945, the audience knew that World War II after that had happened as well. So it makes Mr. Birling, through that use of dramatic irony, it makes him seem even more kind of silly, out of touch politically, economically and socially. So really, really important to grasp that dramatic irony in the play. Then moving on, how does this play out then in terms of context, in terms of J.B. Priestley's views? Now obviously J.B. Priestley is the writer, and he has a very specific agenda. So he believes in that ideology called socialism, the idea that we shouldn't have wild wealth inequalities, and that we should share the money around, and we should kind of look after the working class. So he advocates then for a society based on fairness, equality and shared responsibility. We should care about the weakest in society. So that feeds into, as I just said, that notion or that concept of collective responsibility. Everybody is responsible for each other's well-being. It's not just look after yourself and forget everybody else. We are members of one body, as it's said in the play. So clearly the context of the harshness of 1912 and 1945 society is feeding into Priestley's social views, and he really uses the play as an engine to push forward his socialist ideology, if we're going to be a bit technical about it. Okay, so moving forward then, let's see how this context plays out in action. How does the context affect the play? Well, let's have a little look. So, first off then, Mr. Birling's capitalism versus the Inspector's socialism. We have these two ideologies kind of creating friction in the play. So there's a clash between Mr. Birling's capitalist view, which is basically money, 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 and don't really care about anybody else apart from yourself, and the Inspector's socialist ideals, which were, as we know, all about collective responsibility and sharing the wealth. And it symbolises the tension between 1912 values, which are very capitalist, and 1945 post-war ideals when Priestley was actually writing. And you know, in that period after the Second World War, there was a massive desire for social change. People did not want to go back to the horrors of kind of, you know, runaway, rampant capitalism, and they wanted to lead a better life with things like the NHS and the welfare state. So there's a big ideological conflict between the two there, and that would be really good for you to do a bit of independent research on. Then we have women's roles and gender inequality. So Eva Smith's treatment reflects the gender inequality of 1912 because she's a woman and she's working class, so she gets discriminated in two ways basically. And women in that period had very limited opportunities, and it highlights Priestley's message for social reform. He wants a more gender equal society, and a society in which characters like Eva Smith don't have to suffer under the yoke of patriarchy, basically. So that's a very, very big kind of contextual point. Also, the generational divide and class divisions. So let's just talk about that for a minute. So Sheila and Eric's responses, so those are obviously the younger generation, those are the children of Mr. and Mrs. Birling. Their responses to Eva Smith offer a bit more hope for an equal society, because the older generation, Mr. and Mrs. Birling, they don't want to change. They just want to keep capitalism in place and keep inequality going. But Sheila and Eric don't. They actually have a bit of a kind of an epiphany, and they kind of have what Marxists would call a moment of class consciousness. They become aware of the social class system and the need to change it. So there's a real generational divide in the between the generations of characters in the play, and it would be really good for you to tease that out in class, maybe when you're discussing it with your teacher, and feed that into your essays, especially if Sheila or Eric come up on the exam paper. Okay, now let's have a nice look to round things off with some really key contextual quotes. Okay, so first off then, we've got Mr. Birling's capitalist ideology. So really famous quote, he says, "A man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own." Okay, couldn't be any more capitalist there. Now, that view contextually reflects Mr. Birling's capitalist ideology, and he's emphasising individualism, the idea that you don't care about anybody else but yourself, and self-reliance. Nobody can look after you, so you have to do it yourself. And they were very typical views of the upper class in this period, but as we know, it juxtaposes badly with the Inspector's socialist perspective of collective responsibility, which is obviously J.B. Priestley's view as well. So those two ideologies really clash, and that would be a great quote for you to understand and to just throw into any essay if you're discussing kind of Mr. Birling or the capitalist and socialist ideologies. Okay, moving on. We have the Inspector himself, so he looks very formidable there. So the Inspector on social responsibility. So this is the socialist side of the kind of conflict. We are members of one body. We are responsible for each other. Okay, very dramatic quote there. Now that line symbolises the Inspector's socialist view that we need to look after each other. So he advocates for what we would call social equality and collective responsibility. It contrasts then with the individualism of Mr. Birling that we just saw, and it also foreshadows the post-war societal shift. After World War II, people didn't want to go back to Mr. Birling's world. They wanted a better world, and they wanted a welfare state that looked after people and didn't have wild wealth inequalities. Okay, so that's a really good quote for your essays. Okay, and then lastly, we have Sheila, the younger generation, on the need for social change. So she has a moment of kind of class consciousness when kind of Marxists believe that the rich kind of wake up and realise what the problem is with society. So she says in the play, these girls, that's meaning Eva Smith really, these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. So she humanises the working class there. Really powerful quote. So Sheila's realisation challenges the patriarchal and capitalist attitudes of the time and of her father, Mr. Birling, and reflects the growing awareness in the 1940s for the need for social reform. Okay, the need to build that better world and to actually kind of not go back to the horrors of before the war or economic inequality, which was almost as bad in some ways. So she represents a really kind of a force for good almost, and a real moment of optimism in that quote. Okay then everyone, so if we just kind of have a nice little overview just at the end. Hopefully that's been really useful. We've just given you a really nice overview of the really key context for underpinning Inspector Goole's. We've teased out some of the key features like the class system, dramatic irony, and also some of J.B. Priestley's social views on socialism and capitalism. Teased out some of the gender inequality and the patriarchy that was in this era. And we've also just at the end had a look at some of the key contextual quotes. It'd be really good for you to learn those for any kind of essays and exams that might come up. So all it remains to say is, obviously, if you found this video useful, please hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you won't miss another Let's Learn video from us. And we'll obviously be making loads more videos as we go along. And that's pretty much it. It just remains to say, obviously, thank you for listening and take care. See you soon.